All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Diving into the history of ideas, it's always so fascinating to see how those ideas connect and evolve across time. And today, we're going to be exploring a connection that's particularly intriguing for philosophers, the link between the great Leibniz and the sort of logic revolution that unfolded in the 19th century. It's a story about influence, about independent discovery, about how some ideas can lie dormant for centuries before they're rekindled and reinterpreted in new and groundbreaking ways.
You're absolutely right. It really highlights the complexities of how intellectual progress unfolds. I mean, were those 19th century pioneers directly inspired by Leibniz, or did they, in a sense, reinvent the wheel? That's precisely what we're going to be untangling today. And to guide us on this historical deep dive, we'll be relying primarily on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry, Leibniz's influence on 19th century logic. It's a pretty dense but incredibly thorough academic analysis.
So our mission is to distill those key arguments, to really get to the heart of the debate surrounding this question of influence.
Exactly. Was Leibniz truly a philosophical ancestor of modern logic whose ideas were carried forward by later generations? Or were his brilliant insights ahead of their time, just waiting to be rediscovered? Let's jump right in, shall we? And maybe you can start with what Louis Couturat had to say about all of this. He was a big proponent of Leibniz and argued that he essentially had all the fundamental pieces of algebraic logic already figured out back in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, even before figures like Boole and Schroeder really formalized it in the 19th.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. To say that Leibniz had, essentially laid the groundwork for this whole logical revolution. Of course, the big question is, did Boole and Schroeder and later Frege actually know about Leibniz's logic? I mean, could there really have been a direct influence if they weren't reading and engaging with his work on this front?
Absolutely. And that's where the mystery deepens because, as the Stanford entry points out, for almost 200 years after Leibniz wrote his most significant logical works, they remained largely unknown. They weren't published until the early 20th century. Think about it, 2 centuries of these potentially groundbreaking logical ideas just sitting there, undiscovered.
200 years.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it was like this a lost logic waiting to be unearthed. And I remember the entry mentioned that Leibniz had gained a kind of, notoriety for claiming to have made these amazing discoveries in logic without actually publishing the evidence to support those claims. So maybe it's not that surprising that his logical work wasn't really part of the conversation for all those years.
Right. And we have to remember that Leibniz's interests were so incredibly vast. He was a true polymath: law, diplomacy, mathematics, philosophy, you name it. And his logical explorations were primarily in the form of these unpublished notes and drafts scattered throughout the massive collection in the Hanover Library. So it wasn't as if he was putting these ideas out there in a way that could directly influence subsequent generations of logicians.
So this lost logic starts to emerge a little bit in the 18th century. The entry mentions a few early editions that started to include some of his logical writings.
Yeah, one crucial turning point was Rudolf Erich Raff's 1765 edition. He included a bunch of previously unpublished letters and pieces, including, most importantly, the Nouveau Essai sur l'entendement humain. That was Leibniz's response to Locke's essay concerning human understanding.
Oh, the New Essays. That's a major text in early modern philosophy. So some of Leibniz's logical ideas were getting discussed within that broader epistemological framework.
Right. And while the Nouveau Essai mainly focused on the nature of human understanding, Leibniz did get into logic in Book 4. He talked about the traditional theory of syllogism, but also laid out his vision of logic as this art of judging the ars edicandi, determining the validity of arguments, but also as an ars inveniendi, an art of discovery, of finding new truths. For him, logic wasn't just about analyzing what we already know, but also about how we can generate new knowledge.
And I think this is where we start to see that close connection between logic and mathematics for Leibniz. He famously believed in the possibility of this universal mathematics, right?
Exactly. He argued that traditional syllogistic reasoning is just a part of this broader art of infallibility, which includes any reasoning that operates by virtue of its form. He even critiques the limitations of the algebra of his time. He says it needs to be supplemented by this art of signs or art of characteristic, where you can represent concepts and relationships with precision, like a universal language of thought almost.
It does sound very ambitious, like a true Leibnizian project.
Hmm.
The entry also mentions another edition, Louis Dutel's 1768 edition, which was a collection of his published work. Did that play a significant role in spreading his logical ideas?
Duten's was helpful, for sure. It was a more comprehensive collection of works that were already in print. But Rasp's earlier one with the Nouveau Essai and all those previously unpublished fragments, I think that one had a bigger impact on getting his specific logical thinking out there.
Okay, so we're moving into the 19th century now. And the real turning point seems to be when those huge troves of unpublished papers in Hanover start to become more accessible in the 1830s. It's what the entry calls the second wave of reception.
Right. This period saw this flurry of scholarship on Leibniz in Germany. And the figure who really brings his logic back into the light is Johann Edward Erdmann.
Ah, yes, Erdmann. His edition of Leibniz's philosophical works came out in 1839 and 1840, right? That sounds like a pretty significant event in the history of logic.
It was,
Yeah.
because Erdmann included for the first time these crucial fragments where Leibniz talks about logical calculi. So, for example, there's a 1696 letter to Gabriel Wagner where Leibniz defines logic as the art of using the intellect to evaluate and discover. That's from Erdmann's edition. And even more importantly, he includes the specimen demonstrandi in abstractus fragments.
Right, those fragments are so central to understanding how Leibniz was actually trying to build formal systems of logic. It's
Yeah.
not just theory. He's really trying to put these ideas into practice.
Yeah, exactly. And he even develops his algebraic plus-minus calculus, which he considered a prime example of how you could formalize reasoning processes. And it's fascinating to think about Erdmann, a Kalian himself, publishing these formal logical works of Leibniz. I mean, given Hegel's skepticism towards formal logic, it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. But the Stanford entry suggests that Erdmann was trying to highlight how Leibniz saw this deep connection between mathematics and philosophy. He kind of presented Leibniz's logic as being akin to the rigorous methods of mathematics.
Yeah, and he also drew attention to Leibniz's concept of a character script, that idea of a psigraphy, basically, this universal symbolic language. He pointed out that Leibniz believed such a system could help us identify errors in reasoning simply by looking at how the symbols are manipulated, almost like catching a mistake in a mathematical calculation.
That's really intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how did the philosophical world react to all of this? Did they immediately recognize Leibniz as, the grandfather of modern logic?
Not quite. The reactions were all over the place. You had some, like Gottschalk Eduard Grauer, who basically dismissed the universal characteristic as utopian, like searching for the philosopher's stone.
That's pretty harsh.
It is. But then you had others, like Franz Exner, an Austrian philosopher, who saw Erdmann's edition as illuminating this bigger idea of universal science and expected it to have a really positive influence on the development of philosophy. He emphasized the importance of applying logical rules rigorously, echoing what Leibniz was saying about logic as an art of judgment and invention.
And then there's Gate, who also had some reservations.
Yeah.
Yeah, František Bolomir-Kvat thought the logical fragments were pretty meager and found the idea of an Arsène Mignendi, the art of discovery, to be kind of embarrassing in its impracticality. So it wasn't like Erdmann's edition led to this widespread recognition of Leibniz as a source of modern logical thought.
It seems like the reception was mixed, to say the least. Now, the entry then shifts to another crucial figure in this mid-19th century reception of Leibniz Friedrich Adolf Trendelenburg. And he's interesting because he was actually anti-Hegelian and had this special interest in Leibniz.
Right, Trendelenburg's perspective is really important here. He was the secretary of the Prussian Academy of Science, and Leibniz was their first president, so he had a particular reason to want to, honor Leibniz's legacy. And his 1856 lecture on Leibniz's Entwurf einer allgemeinen Charakteristik, that's outline of a general characteristic, really shaped how people understood Leibniz's logic project.
And in that lecture, he makes a big deal about the importance of signs and notation, even using the term Begriffsschrift, which is so closely associated with Friese now.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how those ideas connect across generations. Trendelenburg saw Leibniz's goal as creating this characteristic language of concepts, but also this general language of matter, where you could analyze complex ideas down into their basic elements and then manipulate those elements using calculation.
So he really understood the significance of Leibniz's idea of a characteristica universalis. But I seem to recall that Trendelenburg himself had some doubts about the feasibility of a logical calculus.
He did. Even though he admired Leibniz's grand vision for a precise symbolic language, he wasn't convinced that you could adequately capture the complex relationships between concepts using the kind of formal operations Leibniz envisioned. And he even cautioned against trying to do too much with calculation and logic at that time, arguing that our scientific understanding of how concepts connect wasn't advanced enough.
That's so interesting. So he's both fascinated by Leibniz's project and skeptical about its practical application.
Mm-hmm.
But then the entry makes this almost paradoxical claim. It says that despite his reservations, Trendelenburg's work became a key reference point for the emergence of mathematical logic.
Right, it seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it. While Trendelenburg didn't necessarily embrace a full-blown logical calculus, his in-depth analysis of Leibniz's project, especially his focus on the need for a precise Begriffsschrift, kind of inadvertently provided this framework for the logicians who came after him and who did champion symbolic logic, people like Frege and Schroeder. They were directly responding to Trendelenburg's interpretation of Leibniz, even if they were moving in different directions. So even his skepticism played a role in shaping the landscape for mathematical logic to develop.
It's like he set the stage without realizing it. So now let's talk about those figures we usually associate most directly with the birth of modern logic: George Boole, William Stanley Jevons, John Venn. How did they encounter Leibniz's work, and what did they make of it?
Okay, so with Boole, who's often considered the founder of algebraic logic, the story is really fascinating. It turns out there's this striking similarity between Boole's famous index law, A equals A squared, the idea that applying a concept twice is the same as applying it once, and some of the things Leibniz had written. A scholar named Robert Leslie Ellis pointed this out after reading Erdmann's edition of Leibniz's works.
So did Boole know about these Leibnizian anticipations when he was developing his own system of logic?
Apparently not. His biographer, Robert Harley, discovered that Boole only found out about these parallels through Ellis more than a year after he published his major work, An Investigation of the Laws of Thought. But what's interesting is that later on, Boole's widow mentioned that he felt this strong intellectual kinship with Leibniz, like they were on the same wavelength across centuries.
That's amazing. What about Jevons?
Jevons, who came up with the principle of substitution, also realized later on that Leibniz had anticipated some of his key ideas. He even admitted that he regretted overlooking Erdmann's edition earlier in his career, saying that lots of other logicians had made the same mistake. He was clearly impressed by Leibniz's wonderful sagacity, as he put it.
And Venn. I mean, his diagrams are still used in logic textbooks today. Did he weigh in on this Leibniz connection?
He did. Venn was actually critical of the claim that Boole was the only modern logician to have noticed this property of logical terms, this idempotence. He pointed out that Leibniz, along with other figures like Lambert, Plouquet, and Segner, had also anticipated it. He even suggested that if people looked more closely at the tradition of Leibnizian and Wolffian logic, they'd probably find even more examples of such insightful anticipations.
So what's the overall takeaway from the Stanford entry? What does it ultimately conclude about Leibniz's actual influence on the development of 19th century logic?
Well, it's nuanced, but basically, while the new logic of the late 19th century did have this Leibnizian spirit, especially after Erdmann and Trendelenburg brought Leibniz's ideas to light, and later logicians did acknowledge his insights and historical priority, there wasn't really any direct initial influence. It seems that Boole, Schroeder, Frege, they all developed their logical systems independently.
So it's like Leibniz was this visionary thinker who had all these amazing ideas that were kind of ahead of their time, and then later on people rediscovered them and realized, wow, Leibniz was onto something here.
Precisely. The foundations of modern logic were really laid independently, but once those foundations were in place, it became clear that Leibniz had been wrestling with many of the same fundamental questions centuries earlier.
So as a philosopher listening to this, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What does this tell us about how intellectual progress actually happens? About the difficulty of getting truly radical ideas out into the world, especially when they're so far ahead of their time? I mean, does the fact that these 19th century logicians kind of rediscovered what Leibniz had already figured out diminish their achievements in any way? Or does it actually show just how powerful and enduring philosophical insight can be, even when it's initially overlooked or forgotten? Maybe this deep dive has sparked a curiosity in you to explore the works of Leibniz, Boole, or Trendelenburg for yourself. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.